Every day, millions of people go to work, run errands, and navigate the safety of ordinary routines of modern life. But sometimes the everyday world turns fatal. In this video, we're revealing 6 ordinary lives that ended in sudden, unthinkable deaths. It was October 3, 2018, in Chicago, Illinois. The evening was quiet inside the mid-rise apartment building on North Clark Street. Downstairs, behind a maintenance door, was the compactor room, a place few residents ever thought about, but one they'd never forget come morning. Timothy Alvarez was 31, a janitor who had worked the night shift for nearly 5 years. He lived alone in a small basement apartment nearby, walking to work with a thermos of coffee and old work gloves tucked in his pocket. Known for being efficient but impatient, he often handled minor maintenance issues himself instead of calling the on-duty engineer. His supervisors tolerated his shortcuts because he rarely complained and kept the trash collection system running smoothly. The building's compactor was semi-automatic. Trash dropped through chutes into a steel bin that compressed waste whenever the motion sensor or timer registered a full load. Protocol required unplugging it before entering, but quick fixes often skipped that step. Tim knew how jams happened: oversized bags caught on the upper hatch. Usually, a broom handle or short climb could dislodge it. Over time, he treated the routine as harmless, unaware that a mistimed cycle could be deadly. That night, shortly after 10 p.m., several residents called the front desk to report a blockage. The refuse chute was backing up on the upper floors, causing odor complaints. The maintenance engineer was off-site, and Tim decided to handle it himself. Security footage later showed him entering the compactor room carrying a flashlight, broom, and small toolkit. Ignoring the breaker switch mounted near the door, he climbed onto the metal lip below the chute and leaned halfway inside, looping his belt around a nearby pipe for balance. A tenant walking his dog near the service corridor later told police he heard a mechanical click, followed by the low whine of a hydraulic pump and a metallic thud. The sensor detected movement in the load bin and triggered a compression cycle. The heavy ram slammed forward just as Tim's footing gave way. The broom hit the floor first, then the impact of his body. When the resident alerted the front desk, the on-call concierge retrieved the maintenance keys before unlocking the door to find the compactor mid-cycle, Tim trapped beneath the steel ram. Emergency stops slammed the machine to a halt, but it was too late. Paramedics arrived within minutes after the concierge's call, disassembling sections of the hydraulic press just to reach him. His torso had been pulverized, organs shredded, blood seeping into the machinery. Tim was pronounced dead at the scene. Authorities classified the death as an occupational accident caused by failure to implement lockout/tagout procedures. Investigators cited the property management company for inadequate machine isolation and training. The complex installed new safety switches and mandatory breaker locks the following month. Tim's family filed a wrongful death claim, which led to updated training requirements and visible warning signage across the company's properties. It was August 22, 2017, in Kuala Lumpur. On the 7th floor of a mid-rise, people were emptying as fluorescent lights hummed and only a few employees remained. In the security booth downstairs, a monitor would later capture one of the city's strangest workplace deaths. Lena Wong was 26, a call center employee for a regional insurance firm. She was diligent, soft-spoken, and known for staying past midnight to meet her daily call targets. Friends said she was methodical, sometimes to the point of anxiety, and rarely left things unfinished. She lived alone in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city and spent most of her time at work or on the phone with her boyfriend, who often kept her company during the late shifts. The building's aging infrastructure had long been part of her nightly routine. The elevator system in the building was more than 15 years old. It ran on a dual-cable traction setup with an automatic leveling feature that often misaligned between floors. The maintenance crew, contracted through a third-party service, was aware of intermittent failures, but continued regular operation while waiting for replacement parts. Employees had been instructed not to tamper with the doors during outages. But after years of minor stoppages, many learned informal workarounds, nudging the doors apart, stepping across the small gap when the car stopped slightly off level. It had become a quiet habit. That Thursday night, just after 11 p.m., Lena finished her last call. She entered the elevator on the 7th floor to head down, but the lift shuddered to a halt between the 5th and 6th. The lights dimmed, leaving her in semi-darkness. After several minutes without movement, she called her boyfriend. He told her to wait, but Lena was restless. CCTV from the hallway showed her forcing open the outer doors, which were supposed to stay locked when no car was present. Years of wear had weakened the interlock, allowing the panels to slide apart. She leaned forward, saw no floor, and must have assumed the car was slightly below her level. In reality, it was 3 floors down, stuck in mid-position after a voltage irregularity tripped the system. Still on speakerphone, she wedged her fingers between the panels, pulling them wider. She placed 1 foot forward, thinking she was stepping onto the car roof. The footage captured her bracing herself on the frame, then shifting her weight forward. A second later, the image blurred as she vanished from the frame. Her boyfriend, still on the call, heard a brief shriek and a metallic thud. At nearly the same moment, 2 maintenance workers downstairs were resetting the main control panel after another unrelated call-out. The power restoration reactivated the elevator's safety circuit, which automatically attempted to return the car to ground level. The system engaged, lowering the stalled car slightly. Lena, already below in the shaft, fell roughly 30 feet, striking a crossbeam before landing in the pit. The shaft contained about 2 feet of oily runoff water from a slow drain leak, enough to submerge part of her body. The motion of the car likely disoriented her further before impact. Security officers arrived within minutes after the system alarmed. They found her mobile phone at the edge of the open doorway. Emergency responders reached the shaft pit by 11:45 p.m. and retrieved her within half an hour. She was unresponsive and pronounced dead at the scene. The coroner listed the cause of death as blunt force trauma with secondary drowning, consistent with partial submersion in the pit water. The residual water in the pit, normally harmless to maintenance staff, had prevented immediate recovery. Building management temporarily shut down both elevators. Government inspectors traced the incident to an outdated control circuit that failed to lock the system when doors were open. Lena's parents flew in from Johor the next morning, escorted by relatives who had learned of the accident through a brief police notice. At the hospital morgue, her mother reportedly refused to leave the hallway until the identification was complete. The funeral took place 3 days later at a small Buddhist temple near her family home. It was October 27, 2016, in Mumbai, India. Morning noise filled the streets, vendors shouting, scooters cutting through traffic, and the air heavy with the smell of oil frying and exhaust. In a cramped apartment kitchen above the market, metal hissed and gas burners roared as one woman rushed to keep up with her orders. Preeti Deshmukh was 48. She had built a modest home-based catering business from nothing after her husband's layoff a decade earlier. She supplied snacks and meals for offices in Dadar and Lower Parel. Her customers praised her consistency. Neighbors said her kitchen never stopped running. Preeti's days began before sunrise, juggling calls, cooking, and deliveries with help from her teenage son, Arav. She had recently invested in new industrial cookware to expand production for the upcoming Diwali rush. Cooking at that scale relied on precision. Pressure cookers, especially large commercial-grade ones, were central to her setup. They saved time but required vigilance, correct gasket placement, pressure regulation, and valve inspection before every use. Preeti, experienced but hurried, had always handled those steps herself. She preferred doing them manually, saying it saved minutes when orders piled up. On that morning, she was behind schedule. Orders for sweets and savory snacks exceeded expectations, and her new 12-liter cooker, recently purchased from a local supplier, was being used for the first time. The gasket slipped when she locked the lid, so she tightened it down by hand, assuming it would seal under heat. Arav, seated at the counter, set up his phone to film a short video for his mother's Facebook page. a light-hearted cooking tutorial. The kitchen footage, later analyzed by investigators, began uneventfully. Preeti moved between burners, stirring one pot and checking another. The large cooker on the rear stove emitted a faint rattle, louder than usual. She glanced back once, then again, expression shifting from focus to mild irritation. Arav can be heard telling her the lid looked loose. She approached, wiped condensation from the handle, and tapped the top with a spoon, a habit she had formed to test for trapped air. For a few seconds, the device begins to hiss sharply. At 8:41 a.m., the safety valve failed. The camera caught a brief flash of steam, followed by a concussive blast that shook the kitchen. The cooker likely experienced a lid-locking failure under overpressure, rupturing along its upper seam and sending fragments outward at high velocity. A piece of the lid struck the ceiling, another embedded in the opposite wall. The shockwave shattered nearby glass jars and threw Arav off his stool. The video cuts abruptly as the phone falls sideways. In the recovered footage, white vapor fills the screen, and a faint cry is audible before the recording ends. Emergency responders arrived within 10 minutes, alerted by neighbors who heard what they described as an explosion. Preeti was found near the stove, unconscious, with severe cranial trauma caused by metal debris. Medical officers confirmed she died instantly from blunt force head injury. The room showed signs of extreme overpressure, cracked tiles, a warped exhaust fan, and a rupture mark on the wall where the lid had struck. Arav, suffering second-degree burns on his face and arms from steam and splattered oil, was taken to Sion Hospital. Forensics later determined the cooker's safety valve was a counterfeit component made of inferior alloy, incapable of venting pressure. Arav spent 3 weeks at Sion Hospital, his arms and face bandaged, unable to eat solid food. Nurses said he rarely spoke except to ask about the camera. When he was discharged, he returned to the apartment with relatives. The kitchen had been cleared of debris, its walls repainted, though the scorch marks remained faintly visible near the stove. For months he avoided entering that room alone. It was July 17, 2017, in Shenzhen, China. The midday crowd moved easily through the glass-fronted atrium of the Longhua shopping plaza. Near one of the main escalators, a father and son lingered, an ordinary errand before lunch, small and forgettable in every way, except for what would happen seconds later. Li Cheng was 39, a warehouse supervisor at a logistics firm in Baoan District. Known by co-workers for his reliability, he rarely missed a shift and often covered for others during peak export months. He lived in a modest apartment with his wife and their 6-year-old son, Hao. Sundays were reserved for family time, a habit Li had started after a back injury forced him to reconsider long hours on the warehouse floor. His routine days were structured and predictable, which made him a dependable presence both at work and at home. He had come to the mall that afternoon to buy school shoes for Hao and a new phone case for his wife. Escalators were common in his daily commute, and like most people, he trusted them without thought. The machines, powered by synchronized chain drives and concealed motors, relied on interlocking metal plates known as comb plates to bridge the gap between moving steps and the landing floor. When properly maintained, the system was safe. But when plates were loosened or removed for cleaning, even small misalignments could expose the spinning drive gears beneath. That morning, outsourced maintenance staff working for a contracted cleaning company had partially dismantled the lower landing panel after a reported spill. According to later investigations, the metal plate was reattached, but not fully locked into its bracket. A warning cone had been placed briefly, then removed before the team finished, as the shift supervisor instructed that the area reopen before shoppers arrived. No follow-up inspection occurred. By noon, the escalator was again filled with weekend traffic. At around 12:43 p.m., Li and Hao reached the base of the escalator. A small plastic toy, a capsule from a vending machine, lay wedged near the first step. Hao pointed it out. Witnesses later said Li smiled and knelt, telling his son to watch as he picked it up. The movement drew his weight over the floor panel, which shifted slightly under him. A metallic creak was heard, followed by the faint grinding of machinery beneath. The plate collapsed without warning. Lee's right arm and shoulder plunged through the opening, and the moving steps dragged him forward. The surrounding crowd froze for a split second before screams filled the atrium. The escalator's motion jammed almost immediately as his body obstructed the lower gears, but the initial force pinned him deeper. A maintenance worker from a nearby store sprinted over and pressed the red emergency button on the side rail. The machinery stopped, but the crushing pressure had already caused fatal chest and abdominal trauma. Shoppers tried prying the edges of the metal panel open using crowbars from a nearby display. Blood spread across the moving steps. Howe, pulled back by two bystanders, screamed until a security guard carried him away. When rescuers arrived about 9 minutes later, power was cut to the entire system before beginning extraction. Lee was pronounced dead at the scene from massive crushing injuries to the torso. The Municipal Safety Bureau concluded that the escalator's floor plate had not been properly fastened after cleaning. The locking bolts were found detached and the retaining hinge bent. The maintenance contractor was fined heavily and 3 employees were dismissed. A memorial display appeared near the plaza entrance for several days, filled with candles. Lee's family held a quiet funeral in Bao'an, attended by his co-workers who later raised funds for Howe's schooling. The mall reopened the escalator 2 months later after replacing the entire unit with a newer, enclosed model. It was February 3, 2015, in São Paulo, Brazil. Dust from ongoing construction drifted along the storefronts on Avenida Celso Garcia. In the soundscape of drills and engines, no one paid attention to the crack lines spreading across the old brick cornice overhead, until it killed someone. Carolina Herrera was 34, the owner of a cramped but well-known shop specializing in alterations and custom dresses. She had started it at 28 after leaving her position at a garment factory, hoping to earn enough to one day open a second branch closer to the city center. Everything she earned was stretched thin, between rent, fabric suppliers, and the recent rise in electricity costs. She did most repairs herself, patching leaks, repainting walls, and fixing the signage with the help of a single assistant named Luana. The building that housed her store dated back to the 1950s. Like many older properties in São Paulo, its facade included a continuous cornice, a cement-rendered brick parapet with embedded steel anchors connecting several shops in a row. Over time, rain, vibration from passing buses, and poor drainage caused gradual deterioration. Months earlier, a renovation project 2 doors down had begun removing sections of adjoining brickwork without proper reinforcement. Carolina had noticed the small cracks forming above her awning, but dismissed them after the site foreman assured her it posed no danger. That Friday, Carolina planned to replace her shop's sun-faded banner before the weekend crowd arrived. The work was simple: climb the aluminum ladder, detach the old cloth, and secure a new one using rope and hooks. She set up the ladder herself while Luana stood nearby, steadying it and occasionally glancing at the nearby scaffolding from the neighboring construction. Around 11:26 a.m., several witnesses later reported hearing a low, shifting rumble from above. One bystander described it as a vibration through the wall rather than a distinct sound. Carolina, halfway up the ladder, leaned forward to fasten the awning's left corner. At that moment, the parapet spanning 3 storefronts cracked across its midpoint. A faint puff of white dust rose before the structure gave way, detaching outward in a slow but unstoppable collapse. Luana shouted and tried to pull the ladder back, but the leading section of masonry struck its top rung, sending both the ladder and Carolina sideways. She fell onto the pavement chest first as fragments of brick and plaster rained down. The impact dislodged part of the metal signage, which folded downward onto her leg. Passers-by screamed and ducked under awnings. A delivery driver abandoned his motorcycle to help. Within seconds, a cloud of dust filled the street. When visibility cleared, Carolina was pinned beneath several pieces of broken masonry, conscious but unable to move. Witnesses tried to lift debris and keep her airway clear, while others called for help. Fire rescue units arrived first, followed by paramedics about 8 minutes later. Rescuers used jacks to raise the heaviest section and applied a neck brace before transporting her to the hospital. Despite surgery to repair severe thoracoabdominal crush injuries, she was pronounced dead that afternoon. Luana sustained minor injuries to her shoulder and leg, but survived. Police cordoned off the sidewalk for structural inspection. A municipal engineering report found that the collapse was caused by improper removal of anchor ties during the neighboring renovation, which destabilized the shared parapet. Investigators also cited the absence of recent building inspections and unauthorized modification permits. The city government responded by launching a month-long inspection drive of older commercial facades. Several properties in the district were temporarily closed pending repairs. The contractor responsible for the renovation was fined and banned from new permits for 1 year. It was October 19, 2018, in Birmingham, England. The small metal fabrication shop on an industrial estate outside the city center hummed with the sounds of machinery winding down for the weekend. Inside the workshop, one hydraulic press sat mid-cycle, half extended and silent. Richard Clay was 43 and had worked maintenance for nearly 2 decades. He was practical, blunt, and prided himself on speed. Co-workers said he disliked delays and rarely followed shutdown procedures if it meant holding up production. Known for fixing things live, he viewed machinery as extensions of his own logic rather than unpredictable systems. He'd learned through experience, not manuals, and his supervisors leaned on that confidence to keep the floor running smoothly. He lived outside the city with his wife and teenage daughter, working overtime most Fridays to cover bills and school expenses. The machine Richard worked on that day was a heavy-duty hydraulic press used to shape small metal parts. It ran on high-pressure fluid that powered a steel plate moving up and down with enormous force. Safety rules required shutting off both power and pressure before doing any maintenance, a process that took time. But for minor jams, workers often skipped it. Richard had done the same quick fix many times before, trusting his timing and experience more than the safety steps he'd been taught. That afternoon, just before 4 p.m., the press jammed mid-descent, halting with a loud hiss. A small team gathered as Richard walked over from his workstation. He tapped the piston housing, muttered that it was just misaligned, and reached for a wrench. A junior co-worker asked if he should pull the main isolator, but Richard declined, saying it wasn't worth the delay. The rest of the floor had begun cleaning up for the day, leaving the area quieter than usual. Only 2 co-workers remained nearby as Richard crouched beneath the half-lowered press to inspect the alignment. For several minutes, he worked beneath the press, loosening a bolt and realigning the guide pins. However, residual hydraulic pressure began to equalize through a worn check valve. He heard a brief hiss, then the steel plate dropped without warning. It came down several inches in a split second, slamming into his chest and shoulder with crushing force. He collapsed instantly, motionless before anyone could hit the emergency stop. They pried the plate up with a hydraulic jack and pulled him free within seconds, while another worker began CPR under instruction from emergency dispatchers. Paramedics arrived in under 10 minutes, accompanied by police. Despite efforts to resuscitate him, the crush injuries were catastrophic, involving multiple fractures and internal trauma. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Authorities issued a prohibition notice classifying the case as a preventable workplace fatality. The company was temporarily shut down pending a full safety audit and mandatory retraining on machine isolation procedures. At home, his wife received the call just after 4:30. She and their daughter arrived at the industrial estate an hour later, waiting outside the cordoned workshop until police escorted them away. In the days that followed, their small house on the outskirts of Birmingham filled with quiet visitors, neighbors bringing food, co-workers stopping by without knowing what to say. His tools, still in the garage, remained untouched for weeks. Thanks for watching. If you're into ordinary life suddenly shifting brutal in an instant, click here for more.